When you're 48 years old and you've been asked to give your last lecture, you have to worry. Do my students know something about my health that I don't? Has there been a discovery about a correlation between pattern bowling and early death before 50 that I didn't know about? Or maybe did I do something wrong? Maybe it wasn't a dream after all. I really didn't manage to find my classroom until the last 5 minutes. And I really was supposed to give a lecture on elementary particles in quantum mechanics? Or could it be that other dream about not quite having sufficient attire over my lower corporeal zones? I hope we've all had that dream, right? It's not just me. If you're a department chair, you have still more reasons to be worried. Did I fail to read carefully enough all those hundreds of budget reconciliation sheets that I signed? Are my colleagues blaming me for their lousy raises yet again? Couldn't I have a second chance if I promise always to read and budget carefully, show up to class on time, and wear pants? All such anxieties aside, it was an honor to be asked to give my last lecture, even if this last lecture is probably more accurately described as my middle lecture. Now that sounds a lot less dramatic. Admittedly, probably no one would have come, I know, than the idea of a professor as Socrates about to be handed that cup of hemlock. I keep wondering, am I going to face the guillotine or firing squad as I exit the room? Anyway, but I arrived here to teach exactly 20 years ago at the age of 28. And I may have, if luck and health hold out, another 20 or so years to go. Knock wood. And so I find myself almost at an even distance from the start and, if I'm lucky, the finish of my teaching career. From this middle point, the illumination of a final vision isn't available. Remember how Dante begins the Inferno. In the middle of life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. Instead of being on a mountaintop with a clear view all around, you find yourself surrounded by trees, just as we're encircled here tonight by these lovely columns. Your forest is populated with massive oaks that bear an uncanny resemblance to your mother and father, hand gesture, you notice, even as there are vigorous saplings springing up that look like your relentlessly energetic boys. Beside the beautifully shaped pear tree off in the distance that holds a hammock with room for two. A craggy chestnut bent down as if by many ice storms reminds you of administration. And then there's the brightly colored maple with leaves that look like your students, and a silver beech tree with branches darting out in the many unpredictable directions of your research and writing. Deep in the middle of this dark wood, you're far too engrossed in the challenges of love and work, family and friends, teaching and scholarship and academic citizenship to pretend to have a grand vision predicated on the imaginative clear-cutting of your world. Even so, you might have some working priorities. And mine, jotted down long ago on a beachside, though too embarrassingly simple and even corny to tell anyone except my wife Caroline, could be boiled down to 3. Love, excellence, experience. If I were really giving my last lecture, I'd be asking myself how much of my life really measured up to those values. Because even though I often forget, and it's hard to get the balance of those three things right, I try to test everything I do against them. Does an activity contribute to your love for the family and friends who shade, shelter, and nourish you? Does it advance excellence, the reach for the highest possible level of achievement of which you're capable? Does it deepen experience, your encounter with the world, with that light and breeze filtering through the leaves, with the shiny and knotted texture of the bark on those trees? It's a constant challenge not to take for granted the trees in that wood, like those encircling columns, not to get distracted, but slap yourself awake to opportunities for meaning-giving love that friends and family offer you, for self-defining excellence that teaching and research provide, for the poetry of experience and a hike in the forest, a close listen to music, or intent look at a painting, or a long, hard gaze at the dying blaze of a sunset. Love, excellence, experience. For obvious reasons, I won't be saying much about the first in that trio tonight, but I will discuss one example, just one example of an activity through which I've been trying to foster excellence and experience in my students and myself at this university. It's a particular kind of teaching that puts me squarely in the middle of my classes. Some of you, such as my superb student Nora Nunn, and others of you it's wonderful to see as well, Rob and Lee and others, know I like occasionally to set up and moderate debates in my classes. But while you might easily see the benefits of debating daycare, the causes of the Civil War, or U.S. foreign policy, the benefits of debate, of being in the middle, may be less self-evident for students interested, as I am, in poetry. Poetry's meditative thought has a kind of inward hum, the hum of emergent thinking, rambling, unshackled, turning in new and often unpredictable and contradictory directions. That's quite different from that outward clash of arguments and debate. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats encapsulates this difference when he says, "We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry." Poetry folds multiple positions within its dense verbal texture, while debate tests them against each other. Yet in spite of this difference, or maybe even because of it, I want to claim that debate can deepen the experience of poetry and other forms of literature and spur excellence in the quality of its analysis. Through debate, you engage poems and classmates with energy and precision, no longer mere passive consumers, but active producers of critical argument. Ever since those spirited late-night debates in my Dunnington dorm and my time as a junior fellow at the Teaching Resource Center, I believed in reasoned dialogue as a fundamental procedure for both education and democracy. Standing under this dome, I don't think I need to tell you who it was who said just before this building was constructed, differences of opinion lead to inquiry, and inquiry leads to truth. If debate is basic to democracy and education, poetry is no less essential to our being fully human, to reflecting on and articulating our experience of being in the world. Now, admittedly, in the literature on how to teach poetry, debate's almost never mentioned. Anxious about the ability of our students to grasp even the basics of a difficult kind of writing, we poetry teachers lecture, we use the Socratic method, we coax students into memorization and recitation. But I think debate can usefully supplement these techniques by making poetry memorable and meaningful through what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur called the conflict of interpretations. Debate also helps disabuse the misperception that some students bring into the humanities classroom, that either knowledge is clear-cut, true or false, right or wrong, as in the sciences, or it's merely subjective and anything goes. Having to develop a position in the face of the other side's skepticism, you learn that interpretive arguments need be neither ironclad nor arbitrary, that they're more or less plausible and persuasive depending on the quality of the reasoning, analysis, and use of evidence. If poetry is no less susceptible to reasoned debate than are the usual issues of public life that are the grist for the deliberative mill, abortion, euthanasia, war, and so forth, then the gap between poetry's subtlety and unpredictability on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ham-fisted sloganeering and cliches in public discourse may itself be productive. The difference could be seen as an opportunity for poetry to put pressure on public discourse, since the mind that has tracked the minute shifts in tone, rhythm, diction, and imagery in poetry may be less easily satisfied with one-dimensional platitudes and pronouncements. Debate may work especially well in the humanities or social sciences classroom as an approach to substantive and unsettled questions to which the teacher believes there are at least two viable contrasting answers, not a single right one. And in my mind, those are the kinds of questions that are at the heart of teaching. I've used debate in many different ways, but for me, the most exciting and innovative approach has been to center debate on a single poem. So I want to talk about two examples tonight that you have on your handout, both published appropriately enough in the middle of the last century. The middle is the theme tonight. I'm not going to read these. I hope you had a chance to peruse them a little bit while we were dealing with the technical issues earlier on. One of the first times I staged a debate about a poem, I asked my students meeting in the basement, that lovely basement of Cabell Hall, whether Philip Larkin's poem, Church Going, the first on your handout, was more religious and nostalgic or skeptical and irreverent. They were to uncover all the evidence they could for Larkin, the disenchanted secularist, on one side, and on the other, Larkin, the pining would-be believer. I told them we all knew the poem to be more complex than either stance. Their job and performing position was thus to make visible one strand of meaning and feeling in the poem. So with about 50 students in my class, I divided them right down the middle aisle and into 8 teams of 5 to 7 on either side, each working on a pair of stanzas. And each team chose a spokesperson who was responsible when the debate began for stating the team's thesis, its main 2 or 3 supporting arguments, and all the evidence of particular words, images, metaphors, rhythms, tonality, and so forth that supported its position. After 20 minutes of animated brainstorming. Each team stood in turn and faced the opposite, paired across the aisle, with each spokesperson presenting the team's findings. And with me, once again, very much in the middle of that aisle. The groups also had time to rebut their opposition, having been encouraged to take notes and come up with specific points to salient issues. In their divergent readings of the title alone, whether church going signals a nostalgic going to the church to find something wondrous or imperiled there, or a pessimistic recognition that the church is going to ruin, to devastation. The students dramatized the tension between the poem's disenchanted secularism and its spiritual longings. They enacted the question of whether, as the secularists felt, the speaker wants to make sure he avoids any religious or ritual event. There's nothing going on. Or as the religionists argue, that he's mysteriously drawn to the church. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do. Is the interior space seen as boring? Another church. And stale? Flowers brownish now, the air tense, musty. Or is it safe? The door thud shut, and alluring, run my hand around the font, even inspiring some reverence, that removal of the bicycle clips. Does his word choice suggest alienation? Some brass stuff up at the holy end? Or familiarity and closeness to the church as part of his life and heritage? Parchment, plate, and pyx. In this fashion, we went through the entire poem, the room brimming with excitement, brimming with excellence and experience. My students wrangling passionately over the meaning of individual words and the entire poem. I was surprised by how well the students mediated, just as I hope they will in their papers, between the kind of nitty-gritty of specific images or words or technical details and broad thematic concerns. Now, occasionally I intervene from my middle perch there to make sure one team responded to the other, or to solicit the views of the rest of the class on the credibility of a point of argument. But I'd never seen such intellectual fire in my classroom, nor such meticulous attention to detail. By the end of the class, my students understood that what made the poem worth rereading was precisely that it blended the two perspectives that they had so ably disentangled. That the poem was more complex in tone, rhetoric, and imagery than either of the views that they had performed. Yes, the speaker is irreverent and unorthodox, sees the institution as doomed, asserts that superstition, like belief, must die, and feels bored, uninformed in a church whose purpose is obscure. At the same time, he's drawn to a space that, unlike the suburb scrub, evokes a mode of reflection that, he says, never can be obsolete. Contemplation of great events in life, such as birth, marriage, death, and that thus resembles poetry as what he calls a ground or house, affording profound rumination. If only because in both the literary and religious sites, as he says, so many dead lie around. So what's my role in all of this? Appropriately enough for this first in the middle lecture series, it's to be in the middle, to establish the teams I'll stand between, structure the debate around a meaty question, somewhere in the middle of which lies the complex truth. Enumerate the kinds of evidence that should be examined, title, the imagery, syntax, diction, so forth. Moderate the debate as it unfolds, and finally, help the whole class arrive at a kind of synthetic vision. The questions I ask have to be interpretively rich if they're to intensify your attention to the significant particulars in the poetry. Answering the nationalist team's argument that Yeats sees the Easter rising as an event of great beauty, as he calls it in his poem Easter 1916. Those of you on the anti-nationalist team focus on the adjective terrible. And in the end, you both understand the bidirectional force of Yeats's famous oxymoron in the refrain, "A terrible beauty is born." In arguing over whether a Seamus Heaney poem about sacrifice, punishment, presents the perspective of victim or victimizer, you dramatize the ambiguity in the poem's opening lines. Whether the speaker identifies with the victim being led to execution as if feeling the halter around his own neck, or with the executioner as if holding the halter and tugging at it. At the beginning of the poem, I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of the neck. Or is it feel the tug of the halter at the nape of the neck? In such cases, the capacity of multivalent phrases, words, lines, and images to embrace conflicting positions becomes vivid in the classroom because you enact divergent readings. Indeed, despite the binary structure of debate, my ultimate goal in deploying it is the dramatization of what we might call the both and of poetry, its capacity for mediating seemingly irreconcilable views. A last example may help show how the to and fro of debate can put into action poetry's both and, or if you will, its in-betweenness, its being in the middle. In my classes, the question of the ultimate sympathies of the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott's A Far Cry from Africa has sparked heated debates. Prodded to scrutinize the poem's title, sharp students like Nora, like Lee, like young men, like Rob, have often begun by debating whether it means that the poet sympathetically listens to the distant cry of African revolt, or whether he feels alienated from a revolutionary, bloody-minded Africa that is a far cry from the continent he has loved. I'll just play the first stanza of this from Derek Walcott.
Playing the trumpet, he couldn't fly batten upon the bloodstream.
What happened? Oh, sorry.
Only the womb, color of carrion cries, waste no compassion on the separate dead. Statistics justify and scholars see the salience of colonial policy. What is that to the white child hacked in death, to savages, expendable Jews?
One team notes the personification of Africa as a beast in the word pelt, suggesting the poet's identification with the colonizer's vision of the continent. But those of you in the opposing group see in the word an Africa slaughtered like a beast by the colonizers, as against the hopeful wind of anti-colonial revolution sweeping through Africa. The pro-British team seizes on the seemingly racist comparison of the Mau Mau rebels to flies. But the pro-African team emphasizes the agility of these quick insects. The Mau Mau rebels, retort the Europeanists, feed off the bloodstreams of their anti-colonial terrorism. No, say the Africanists, these bloodstreams are the aftermath of colonial violence and oppression from which the anti-colonial freedom fighters now draw their revolutionary strength. But the poet's very language shows his British allegiances, according to one team, which emphasizes the high literary diction in words like batten and even the use of the Afrikaans term veld. The other team, however, sees the poet as ironically twisting and emptying out these words, echoing but inverting the colonial perversion of such terms. For one team, the dead, for whom the poet conjures compassion, are the white victims of the Mau Mau rebellion, such as the white child hacked in bed. For the other team, these dead are the victims of the colonial policy, treated as savages, their slaughter compared to that of the Holocaust, the most extreme example of systematic and mechanized genocide in human history. And that's my students debating just the first stanza of this poem. As you proceed through the rest of the poem, you increasingly incorporate the claims of the opposite side to strengthen your position. In the final twists and turns of the poem, in that last stanza, the speaker figures himself as divided to the vein, balancing his love of the English tongue in which he's writing these poems against his abhorrence of what he calls the drunken officer of British rule. His blood ties as an Afro-Caribbean to Africa against his revulsion toward the Mau Mau rebels' slaughter of innocents. By staging the conflicting impulses embedded in the fabric of the poem, especially at a time of oversimplifying public discourse on terrorism, race, and such matters, you make graphic and unforgettable Walcott's articulation of the inner divisions of post-colonial experience. Now, debates like this consume class time, and they detract from coverage, as we call it. So why not just lecture? Well, I think because debate heightens the motivation to aspire to excellence. When you have to rely on your own wits and on teammates to argue a particular position in front of your peers, you've taught me you seize on the poetry with astonishing energy. Debate can sharpen communication and critical thinking skills, helping you gain a keener understanding of what counts as evidence and argument in literary interpretation. It also makes the experience of poetry more memorable. If you have to stand and defend a particular reading of a particular phrase before your classmates, that phrase will more likely be emblazoned on your mind than if you merely jot down a professor's gloss. For me as a teacher, debate turns the classroom into a more dramatic and an interactive space. And when I'm very much in the middle of it all, surprised and schooled by my students' independent critical thinking, I become a more engaged participant in the life of the class. So I've tried to suggest debate can augment your appreciation for poetry's capacity to embody conflicting visions of reality in its verbal intricacies. Through debate, the double vision of poetry works emotionally and formally turned in opposite directions, comes to life in a way that neither lecture nor Socratic questioning nor recitation is likely to accomplish. Applying William Blake's maxim, I think we can say of teaching, without contraries is no progression. Debate spins out the intellectual antitheses and tensions embedded within poetry. But the insistently binary structure of debate, seemingly the form's greatest liability, can become a tool for undoing binaries, since debate can reveal how poems, unlike many other forms of discourse, mediate or elude, complicate or override contradictions. And it's a grasp of poetry's multi-voicedness, of that endless quarrel within, that's key to your continuing enjoyment of poems through a lifetime of reading. Although this was meant to be my last lecture, I hope you'll excuse me for inaugurating instead the middle lecture series, a series, if it ever really came to pass, that would be devoted neither to lastness nor to firstness, but to middleness. The middleness maybe of middle age, the middleness of those vexed efforts to balance love and excellence and experience. The middleness of an academic career dedicated to, if often falling short of, excellence in teaching and scholarship. The middleness of a teacher between opposing teams, excitedly bringing the experience of poetry to life through the excellence of their insights. The middleness of great literature that absorbs and entwines opposite views in its multi-layered fabric. And the middleness of a professor in the midst of an intellectual community of students and faculty who've enriched immeasurably the pleasures of the life of the mind. A life of the mind that inspires all of us in this room, as if the love of thinking were the very structure of the dome that huddles us under its immensity and elegance.